So far, we have written a single huge UI React component, right, which is our book list. However, it's important to talk about how components are actually useful, and they actually have some benefits. One of the major benefits is behavior encapsulation, because each component is meant to represent a single chunk of the UI. It's quite easy to abstract and to think about it not in a global state, but they actually have their own state, internal state and logic. So that kind of helps you break down your UI. Another benefit is precision updating of the UI. This is not something that you do, but actually that React does for you. So instead of redrawing or changing the entire screen that you present to the user, you kind of just let React update certain parts of those screens. And the most obvious benefit, you could say, once you have encapsulated your UI into reusable state or into separate components, is reusability, right? If you have designed your components properly and their APIs, you should be able to use them throughout your app, right? You might allow a little bit of customization, but you don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time that you want to create a new screen. So in order to illustrate this point, we're gonna create a reusable button. We're gonna take our current button component in our screen and we're just gonna abstract it away. Mostly as an exercise, it should be fairly simple. So I'm gonna create a new folder. I'm gonna call this component. And instead of components, I'm gonna create a button.component.tsx file. So once again, I'm gonna take the code from the lesson and let's just walk over it. So I'm just gonna ignore the import for now. Don't worry too much about them. And I'm gonna focus on the props, right? So the props are pretty much the API that your component is gonna have to the outside world. So the first thing that you will notice is that I have imported the touchable opacity props, which come from React Native. So this is fairly important because it's a button, and a lot of the properties that a button takes, they are already defined for you. So it's actually smart to see if you can reuse, or at the very least keep a very similar API to the components that already exist within the platform, because otherwise you're gonna go chasing names all the time, right? You're gonna have to open the component, or you're gonna have to rely on autocompletion to kind of know what props your component takes. Whereas if you keep it mostly similar, at some point you will just learn it, right? It's one of those things that over time it gets imprinted on your brain. So I'm just gonna take all the props from a touchable component, which is defined by React Native, and I'm just gonna extend them. I'm gonna create on top of those. So as my first custom prop that I'm gonna pass to a button is the title. It's fairly simple, it's just a string. Then I'm gonna use this pattern. Each button is gonna have a type prop, and depending on which type it gets passed, it's gonna have different styling, right? But basically in your app, you're gonna have a bunch of different buttons. Sometimes they're gonna be colored, sometimes they're gonna be flat, sometimes they're gonna be red because, you know, there's a dangerous action, you could delete something, and so on and so forth. So you don't want to have this too spread around, because again, at some point you're gonna end up chasing buttons all over your code base, right? So you kind of want to put everything within one single component. And in order to select which type of button you want, this is a pattern that works fairly well. So the last and final prop is a style prop. And this is particularly useful for those one-off cases. You know, sometimes you have a button in the screen that needs to look a little bit different, needs to have a different color or something. So instead of creating a complete new style just for that one use case, you can actually allow for some customization, right? If it's necessary, then you can do it. And that's pretty much it. I think that's the only interesting thing that we're gonna do in this button. I just extract my 3 properties from the props, and then I just take the rest of them, which are all the touchable opacity props. I'm just gonna pass all the touchable opacity props to a proper touchable opacity, and inside of this I'm just gonna just fix this. That doesn't fix it. Right, because it can be undefined. How can we fix this? Well, let's just say you need to pass this. All right, so, and then I just passed it to my inner container for my view, and that's pretty much it, right? So I have defined my 2 different styles. So what I'm gonna do, one more time, I'm gonna create my index.ts file. I'm gonna export from my button component, and on my books container, I'm gonna replace this one with my button, and I'm gonna tell it you are now, the title is at, and you have a primary type. There you go. It's not super pretty, but doesn't matter. So you're probably wondering, you might have noticed that, how do you evaluate what's a correct API, right? How do you evaluate what's good prop passing from bad prop passing, or how big should a component be? To be honest with you, there is no right answer here. It's one of those things that as you go developing your application, you will kind of realize, some components might get big. They might start big, and as you develop, it's like, oh, I have to break this down. Or they might just grow over time, and you realize, well, this is now way too large. I kind of need to break it down even more. Or you will make some mistakes, right? You will create a certain interface for your component and then realize it's too hard to use, right? You end up passing 20 things and still you don't understand really what's going on. So it's really hard. There's no hard rule here. I can give you 3 tips though. One is you want to avoid prop passing as much as you can. That is, don't make it take 100 parameters in order to work. That just complicates things at some point, right? It gets hard to reason about all your components and all the props and where they have come from and where they going. So try to keep it simple. Try to divide. If you have too many props, try to divide your component even further. The second advice is avoid excessive nested prop passing, right? If you have 4 different components, a parent and a child, and a parent and a child, and another child, and if you pass one component right from the parent all the way to the bottom and not use it in a way, right? You're just passing it because that component needs it. Then that also is an anti-pattern. That gets really hard to refactor at some point. If you have that kind of thing, I would suggest don't put it as a prop. Put it in your MobX state, or put it in a hook or something like that, right? Like extract it from prop passing and make it directly accessible to the child component. Even if it's just one, sometimes it might be worth to do this change just for one, because once you change something, then you have to touch 4 different components that may not have to do anything with your changes, and that just gets hard. And the third tip is names. Like we saw in the button, I'm reusing the touchable opacity props because I have seen people who, they come up with their own kind of names, and then it's like nobody understands anything, right? Even if you at some point made a gallery of all your components that you create in your application, there's just too many of them, right? Some people want to name this type, some people name it style, some people name it, I don't know, primary, right? They put it as a boolean or something like that. So again, it gets complicated. What you want to do is just try to keep it simple, try to reuse as much names as possible, and on the long run that pays off.